Hello everybody, this is Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, where we make plugins and live streams and of course tutorials, one of which you are watching right now. And today we are going to be talking about what's new in S26.1. Now, normally in the month or two after a big version of Cinema comes out, there is a point release and it's usually a bug fix update, just some tweaks. But in this case, there are a series of new features that I thought warranted a new video. Some really cool features that I'm excited about. And we're going to begin and end with some stuff involving the new simulations, beginning with the front and back colliders in the simulation system. This is a very simple setting that actually opens up a lot of opportunities when it comes to doing rope and cloth. I actually created the scene file for the regular S26 video, but it wasn't quite working as well as I wanted it to, so I actually pulled it from the demo. And let me show you what was going on. If I hit play, you're going to see the text is going to fall and it's going to start getting crushed between these rollers and it's tearing apart, which is all really cool. I really like it. But you'll see the problem is that these polygons are intersecting the rollers and they're getting stuck to it and it's just pulling it around and around, which in some ways is kind of cool. But I wanted it to fall through and keep getting crushed over and over again. So it didn't work as well as I wanted it to. And if you go into your simulation settings, so hitting Command or Control D, go to simulation. And you'll see that we've got, right here, I've got default settings pretty much on everything. But no matter how many times I increase the collision passes or the polish iterations or any of the settings, I couldn't stop it from sneaking just a little bit inside the model and then it would get trapped. But now, I'll pause it, rewind, and let's take a look at a setting that we have by selecting, I'll select all of them. These are the collider tags, the simulation collider tags, and you'll see a new setting called Collider Side. Now, before the default, well, essentially there was no setting. What was happening is it was seeing the front and the back at the same time. But now when you create this tag, it's going to be set to front by default, which means it's only looking at the front side of the polygons. So not changing anything except for going from looking at front and back via both. I'll say, let's look at the front only. Hitting play. Let's watch this letter go down. We see it get caught between the crushers and it's getting crushed. And look, it didn't get twisted around the outside and it falls through the second pair. And then finally through the third pair of rollers, crushing it down, tearing all the shapes, shredding it pretty much perfectly. Very happy. That's the only change I made from the original file. And you see this is working exactly the way I would want it to. Rewinding all the way. It's amazing how simple a subtle little change of setting like that, seeing the front or back of a polygon, will completely change the way the simulation is working. So very pleased with that overall. If you want to get a little bit weird with it, let me rewind. You can say, hey, don't look at the front of the polygons, look at the back of them only. And in this case, if I hit play, the text is going to fall and get sucked inside of both these rollers, get torn apart. And if we zoom inside one of them, kind of like we've got a tumble dry going where this is trapped inside and it'll just forever be rotating around by seeing only the back side of the polygons. So definitely opens up a lot more possibilities when it comes to these types of simulations. Most of the time you won't even have to think about it because the default is set to the front. Let's see if I hit front right now. Yeah, suddenly they all get flung outside of the object. So, there's possibilities for doing some crazy things by turning that on and off even. But very pleased with that. And this will lead us directly into our next scene file. And that is this one, all about clothing. Now, let me walk through my setup here. First of all, I imported a Mixamo model, which is kind of this mannequin shape, and it's a Mixamo animation. And I intentionally keyframed it to start in a T-pose, and it transitions into the jumping animation, which it will then loop. So I intentionally set that up to make it easy on myself, because if it's in a T-pose, it's going to be really easy to dress the character instead of it being in some sort of crazy pose. So I've got a base mesh here where it's unmodified. And to make the clothing, I just did the most straightforward thing possible, which would be like doing a loop selection here and across the arm and the arm, maybe one around the neck. Not there, but here, UF for fill. And now you can see I've selected just those polygons. I could expand it, change it, loop it. But in this case, I would hit UP to split it off as a separate model entirely. I could rename that shirt. And then in this case, I want it to be a little bit away from the body. So something simple like D for extrude these out just a bit. And then make sure you invert UI, because now that extra extruded polygon, I can select all of those, delete that, and now we just get this outer shell of a shirt, which, very important for making that overall. So we're not going to step through making all of the clothing, but that's pretty much the way I did all of it. So as straightforward as possible. So we'll delete that one we just made and just pop open this one. I've got very basic colors on everything. Let's take a look. We got the original model. It's going to be animated, and there's a collider tag on it. And the collider tag is now set to front. Actually, why don't we set it to both so we can see the problems that we were having, and then we can see how it is improved. And then we've also got a pair of pants. I'll activate that. Exact same idea. The only thing I'll do on this one is right-click, add a simulation cloth belt tag. What do I want to belt onto? I would like it to belt onto the original mesh. And select some points. I've already got an outline of these points on the top because I want those to kind of be stuck like a belt. All I have to do is say set, and that should now be linked to the body. The only other change I'd like is this belt. It doesn't have to be 100% stuck in that spot, so I'll lower the influence to 50-50. That should keep it stuck pretty much where it is, but it's got a little bit of leeway to wiggle around. Then selecting the shirt and the pants model, right-clicking, going to simulation and adding that cloth tag on there, leaving it on the defaults, hitting Control or Command D, we can go and take a look at the simulation settings, which are all set to the defaults, except I went from GPU to CPU because my computer likes that a little bit better. So changing nothing else, I can select the collider tag, and you'll see currently it's set to both, which is the front and the back side. And let's hit play and look at the problems that we are having with it. So as soon as we hit play, you can see that the character's looking good. It's bending over nicely. Not too bad, but you'll see quickly that right around the waist, this is starting to pass through the body and it's getting trapped because it bent over and forced these pants to pass through the body. The exact same thing happened kind of under the arms and also on the back of the knees. And you can tell what's happening if we hit play, that as the character bends down, the legs pass through themselves and it forces the pants to intersect the model, and now they can't escape because they're colliding with the front side and the back side at the same time. There's no way around that. But rewinding and saying, okay, on the main body, let's say that you only collide with the front side, changing nothing else. So this one new feature, now hitting play as the character goes to bend over, you can see as he jumps that the pants are still on the outside of the body. If I zoom around to the back, the knees are not escaping through the back of the pants. You can see right there as it forces that flashed that way. But overall, you can see that this is recovering really well. A single little change to that setting, opening up all of these possibilities. So with that all looking great right out of the box, I thought I would push the setting a little bit further. So why don't we try layering some clothing on top of the clothing? So let's open up this little vest, a little bit Marty McFly, add another simulation cloth tag, changing nothing else. I'll hit play, and you can see that this cloth is hanging on top of the shirt, on top of the body, and he jumps, and it's just layered up, and it's looking great right out of the box, not making any changes whatsoever. Now, there are changes that we can make. We could increase the collisions. We could increase the different sub-steps, lots of different things you can do to increase accuracy, but out of the box, it's working great. Another thing to keep in mind is we've got our default bendiness and stretchiness. So right now, it's the default, so it's trying not to stretch very much. You can see that the shape is maintained very well. But we could add a lot of stretchiness. It's hard to guess exactly what the values are, so I do those order of magnitude jumps. So here's stretchiness of 11, and you can see that it seems to drag down a little bit. I'm going to intentionally go overboard and set to like 111. And now, when I hit play, you can see that the vest is super draping down like it's some sort of cape, but it's still sticking on the character, and you can jump, and it's looking fine. So you can play with that. We've also got the bendiness, which is how stiff it's going to be. So I can say 0 bendiness, and you're going to see that doesn't want to bend very much. It's going to return back to the shape the best it can. You can see it doesn't flap up too much. It's maintaining that shape pretty well. But if I say bendiness, we jump up to a huge number like 555, now it's going to be free to bend a lot. So as the character goes to jump, we see it is crumpling and lifting way further into the air. So you do have those settings and everything overlapped. We change the friction. We can change the thickness of what the cloth is supposed to be as far as the simulation is concerned. And well, just for fun, let's add another layer on here. I've got this crazy robe on top of it, or maybe a raincoat. By right-clicking on there, adding another simulation tag of cloth, changing nothing, hitting play. Now we have cloth on top of cloth on top of cloth on top of a character all running right here in the viewport. And you can see that everything's doing an excellent job of just running. So we have now got good looking clothing in cinema with very little effort. And this, like I said, this is me not even changing defaults. We could make this be bending more, add more thickness. You could bake one layer to be confident that's exactly the way you want it to be, and then layer up additional things on top of that. And this is just me tinkering around, and as I pushed it, everything just seemed to work pretty well out of the box. So very excited about our new possibilities here. Like, look at these, like just the layers overlapping. And this is relatively clean and low poly, but you can imagine if you increase the polygons, and there's going to be more areas that this could wrinkle, just opening up so many fun facets, an area of cinema that we would have always struggled with in the past, and now it just works. Now, there's going to be some more simulation stuff to talk about in a little bit, but I'm going to say that for last because simulation stuff is fun. So we'll start with that. We'll end with that. Talk about some other features. One of those I can show right here, and it was something that was driving me crazy, and that is actually, why don't I open up this other version of Cinema and drag it over? So here's just S26, and something that would happen to me all the time, it's just the way I work, is when I have a menu and we've got these different collapsible sections here, these different groups, that's the way Cinema's been for a little bit, but they redesigned the interface visually a little bit. But the problem is if I change a value, let's say I want to change the FPS from 30 to 24, it doesn't acknowledge right away. And I would never click enter. What I would do is just click in some blank spot. So what I kept on doing was clicking in this blank spot here, which is what I always used to do. But you'll see that it actually collapses the interface instead of just refreshing. Now, it did refresh, but I kept on collapsing the interface, and you'll see me have been doing this for the last 2 months in my live streams. But jumping into the new 0.1 update, you'll see that if I go into a collapsed menu and I activate some settings, and instead of hitting enter, I'll click in that same spot again. But now it doesn't collapse the menu. To me, even though that's the tiniest thing, but to me, that is a huge quality of life improvement, and I just wanted to make sure to mention that. Moving on to some tweaks in the animation mode. For that, I need this scene file where I've got a stack of low poly crates that I created. What I'd like to do is record their dynamics, and the nice new way we have of doing that from a few versions back is using the dynamic placement tool. Now, if you recall, they added in the ability for us to keyframe that via animate, record, Cappuccino. If you haven't played with Cappuccino, it's very powerful. It allows you in real time to capture the position, scale, and rotation of all of your objects. And then we have our dynamic placement tool. If I hold down Shift, it automatically adds gravity. So holding down Shift, I can click, actually let me click Start Real Time. Then holding down Shift for gravity, I can click and drag, and now all these objects will dynamically fall. And you can see the keyframes being recorded as it goes, as all those fall down to the ground. Awesome, all that has been captured. Close down Cappuccino, and now I've just got some straight up keyframes, and that's with never having added any dynamic tags or anything into the scene. But anyway, all of that was set up to show that we've now got a whole bunch of different objects with different keyframes that we can now modify with the animation mode. Now, in order to show you what this does, actually, I feel a little bit silly because I actually didn't know what animation mode did for the longest time. So if you are not familiar, what I'm able to do is, well, let me show you. If I go to, say, just move, I select this top cube and say, I would like to move you over here, you'll see that that will move, but there's a keyframe. So as soon as we do any kind of play, if I go forward 1 frame, it suddenly jumps back to where it's supposed to be because all of the keyframes, the position and the scale and rotation are all kind of recorded at a particular spot. But if we go into animation mode, which you click on the model mode, and you can see object mode and animation mode, there are now changes in the animation mode. Now, in the most basic form, this is what you could do with animation mode before. Is I could click and I could drag this, and you see all of the keyframes are moving relative to that movement. So when I hit play, that independent cube will scoot over there, offset by any changes I made. Now, I shall undo and jump back into our 25, not 0.1, to show you what it was limited to. So select, these are all still animated. If I hit play, you'll see they'll all collapse, and they've all got their own keyframes going. So inside of animation mode, I'll pause that. And what I'd like to do is select all of these and move all of them to the side. So you see if I click and try and drag, I can't move them. If I select only one, I can take that and I can move that and offset it, and it will be properly offset. That's one thing. In addition to that, if I were to try and click on any of these other boxes, you can see that I can't select them. I have to manually select it here in the Object Manager. In addition to that, if I select all of them, and well, first of all, they don't move, but if I select just one and hold down Control as I drag, you'll see that it didn't make a copy, even though in Cinema, holding down Control or Command will make a duplicate of your object. So moving back into 0.1, we've got new changes in which I can grab the entire stack and I can move the entire stack and see all of them getting offset in space. hitting play, all of them have moved over there. In addition to that, I can deselect everything and say, I want that one. And you can see I can just, in the viewport, select any given object and it will jump to that. So again, very nice. And finally, selecting all of them. If I hold down Control as I drag, you'll see I will make a duplicate stack of all of them. So just some nice tweaks that make the animation mode behave a little bit more like all the other modes inside of Cinema. So very handy. And I think I'll be using this animation mode more often because I didn't quite realize what it did. Moving on, we've got the new Brush and Magnet Relax mode. Using this Quixel Megascans model, I'll select that. We're in polygon mode, and we want to use the magnet or brush tool. So the magnet is MI, and the brush tool is MC. The only difference between them that I can tell is the brush tool allows you to brush over the entire model, and the magnet tool, you click in one particular spot, and that's the only area that it's applied. Now, instead of using the relax mode, let's start out with the smooth mode to look at the closest comparable thing. So looking at this model, you see we've got a nice amount of detail on it. But if I click and start smoothing, you can see that all these polygons become nice and clean and rounded, but we're losing all the detail. Like everything's just smoothing away. Hitting undo, instead of using the smooth mode, we can click on relax mode. And the main difference here is the relax mode is trying to maintain the volume or sort of the topography of it. So if I click and start painting here, you can see that the nose isn't disappearing. The eye isn't disappearing. The polygons are moving. And you can see if I hit undo and redo, that they've moved a lot, but the actual model has been maintained, the overall shape. So clicking and smoothing out all of these different polygons, you can see that everything gets nice and even, but we don't lose the overall shape in contrast to the smooth completely obliterating everything. So a nice tweak to a modeling tool for sure. Moving right along, we have new changes to the volume builder via the implementation of the version 9 core of the OpenVDB. Now, this has two main implications for us. Let me open up this file. The first one, I don't have a good demo for this, but I've been doing speed tests and the new core is faster. My own test while I was practicing getting some videos ready for the upcoming utility splines from Rocket Lasso, I was getting speed increases of about 1.3 to 1.6, depending on the scene file. So not quite ready to show those off yet, but yeah, definitely speed up. But in addition to that, we've got a really cool additional feature. To show it, here's a simple cube and some text. Let me feed the cube in a volume builder, default settings, and the text. Pulling the text down, let's have it intersect just a little bit. Click on the volume builder and crank up that resolution, pretty sharp, lots of detail there. Now, right now, everything's kind of just blobbing together. We have a union of those two objects. If I zoom up, kind of in the old school metaball way, these shapes just blend into each other. But now you'll see right away there's a new setting. On any object that is getting combined with the objects underneath, there's now a radius slider. By increasing this radius, we are going to get a smooth transition from the different intersection points. So in this case, you see we get this flat surface, and then we go up this wall, and now we get this almost perfect Boolean bevel going as they transition. And we can keep on increasing that, and look at, oh, that's gorgeous. I'm trying to think of how I would have modeled that otherwise, and it would have been relatively difficult, and that's just looking really nice out of the box. Switching it up, how about we subtract? Let's get rid of the radius and say the text will subtract. Pull that down further. And you see pulling that down, nice and fast to calculate. And now the radius on that one will transition from the smooth ground to the vertical wall. And now we can get a nice smooth radius from one surface to the other again. Even crank up that resolution even more, get that super duper sharp, and maybe not quite as much radius. And again, like it's just a very complex shape that I'm not sure how I would model otherwise. And of course, this can be combined with the S26 remesh, the remesher from ZBrush to get really nice topography, because obviously this is going to be very heavily subdivided. Up next, we've got some new HDRIs, materials, and imperfection maps inside the Assets browser. So to begin with, I've got a little still life here. This file is mostly based off of my slicer demo video from one of our plugins. A couple little tweaks. But before we get here, I want to show that I want to make this cloth kind of draped over because there's a couple different cloth materials. And to do that, I got to use that new front side collisions where you can see I wanted this piece of cloth to kind of fold over more. So I wanted more cloth there, but I didn't want to spend too much time modeling it up that way. So I just let this intersect the head and the shoulder, But when I hit play, you'll see that that will actually pop out from the shoulder and push away from the head, perfectly folding and layering on top of the model. So I just want to throw out that is an additional thing that it just instantly worked for me on my first try. So very, very pleased with the ability to do that type of thing. But anyway, closing that, we'll move back into the main file and move into the asset browser, popping that open. To find, let's begin with HDRs. To find those, let's move into textures, open that up, and you'll see there's an HDR folder. Clicking on that, we have a bunch of HDRs, and there's also legacy ones. So all of the old ones have been organized into one spot, and they're of varying quality and resolution. But now there are a whole bunch here, 12 different ones, and they're all 16K. So these are huge. I've downloaded a few of them. And if we select one of them, we can get some details. These are from Jorgen Herland. So if you go to jorgenhdri.com, then you can get more of their work. But for now, why don't we pop open a Redshift dome light. I am in Redshift right now. And inside of this dome light, I will drag, let's grab this daylight and drop it in there. It's going to take a second for that to load in because, again, 16K. But that pops open. Now, if I go into our preferences, Command or Control E, we can move into viewport hardware, and there's a new setting here that's worth mentioning. I actually changed it. This dome light resolution is new in Redshift. If I go back to default, it actually defaults to 2K, and you can see we've got a nice big resolution on that HDR, even in the viewport. But for me, I don't need that to have too much resolution in the viewport, so I dropped it down so it doesn't eat up as much memory. And we've also got our default resolution, which, let's see what that defaults to these days. That is actually, yeah, 256. But I upped that to 512 just to get a little more detail in the materials. And this does apply to Redshift as well. So keep that in mind. Closing those preferences, let's drag in a different HDRI. Here is a nice warehouse, which I think I'll stick with here. And let that load in. Again, 16K. And let's see what the final might look like by opening up our render view. And set that to begin rendering. I'll leave it at a relatively low resolution, but I will fit it to the window. Let that render. And just for my own preference, I'm going to double the brightness, which is probably overdoing it, but that's going to illuminate this a little bit better for our materials. And now let's talk about the materials. And to show that, I'll move back into our asset browser, collapse the textures, and this time we'll move into materials because these are not textures. A texture would be a JPEG or a TIFF or something like that. But inside of materials, we now have a Redshift category. And inside of there, we can move into, say, leather, and we've got different leathers. We can go into liquid and metal, so there's a couple different ones there. Now, something I didn't know, if I just click on Redshift, we'll see these folders. But if I middle mouse button click, it'll actually show the folders and all the contents of the folders. So we got a couple of nice new Redshift materials here. Let's just spend a few minutes playing with these. By opening up my material manager, you'll see I've actually already loaded all of those in. They're all 4K, so it takes a little bit to go, so I just thought that would save some time. Collapse that down, and let's just begin applying some of these materials around. I'll drop this metallic chrome on this orb. You'll see that even something clean like this metallic chrome, you'll see that some of those new imperfection maps have been fed through into the roughness. So even the simple clean ones, a little bit of imperfection on them, which is great. Let's drop the plastic on the fruit bowl, and let's grab this walnut, and I'll drop it on the statue, and some oak flooring. I'll put that on the table. I've actually got a wall and some pillars here, so I can apply some plaster onto there. Let's try 2 different types of plaster. Then we've got some different fabrics. So here is some black leather. I'll drop here, some yellow fabric right there, and we've got some red leather. I'll drop on this one, and then we've got a couple different types of glass. So I would like to find our liquid here, and I've got a glass. I'll put a clear glass on there, put this other glass on this glass instant, and we got a couple different liquids. So we got liquid water, but let's use this white wine, and we'll use some red wine. We've got these coasters. I suppose I'll just make those coasters out of leather. And what else do we have? Well, we've got this skull here. I'd love to texture that one up. But just to show you, if you haven't played too much with Redshift, how about we make a duplicate of this walnut material? And I'll drop that. If we go inside the skull, you'll see it's actually a cloner setup. So if I were to drop that material onto the overall skull, it's going to be viewing and applying these materials on the cloners. And by default, I already had those randomly colorized anywhere from white to black. So through MoGraph. So moving into this material, I can say, hey, that base color, I would like it to be brighter or darker. So double clicking, I'll look for a correction, a color correct, drag that in, and I'd like to connect the wires. And instead of that just being a overall color correction, let's modify it with some user data. So double click, color user data. What should that user data be driven by? Well, I'd like it to be from MoGraph color. So that's anywhere from white to black. So feeding that through, we could feed that directly into gamma, but instead I'll bring in a range. So I can change the range. So now it's going to take 0 to 1, which is white to black. And I'll input that and output that to gamma and say, I'd like this to go from anywhere from 0.5 all the way to 2. So nice and bright and pretty dark overall. That should be feeding all the way through that system. And close that up. We can see it's showing up in the viewport pretty well. But let's drag back up our render view, and very quickly we can see this beginning to render and fill up. And here's all of those materials applied very, very quickly. And you can see we've got this color variation on the skull. I'm going to set this up. Let's go even a little bit brighter on that illumination. Let's just see how that looks. Yeah, a little bit brighter. And I'm going to set this up for a full render, and I'll let that go. And rendered. And we can see now that a couple of tweaks I would make, probably make the plaster a little smaller here, maybe make that one a little bit larger. I would probably brighten up the wood a little bit in this particular instance, but you can see a whole bunch of materials ready to be used in Redshift. But for now, how about we move into taking a look at the imperfection maps that come in this version of Cinema. Turning off bucket rendering, and scoot that to the side, and new material, I'll say create Redshift Material Standard, and I am set up to be in the new nodes, not the old nodes. Something worth noting is if you single click on this material, it's going to show this material manager here, the nice simple clean one, very similar to what we're used to in classic Cinema. But now if you double click on the material, it will pop open the node editor, even though it's the new node setup. Moving further, I'd like this to be a metallic material. Just crank up metalness all the way, and I'll crank up roughness all the way. Now, roughness is already here by default, but remember in 26, they added the ability to have any of these parameters be popped up in your node automatically if you hold down Control or Command on the Mac. In this case, let's do the IOR, which I'm not going to be using, but if I hold down Control, I can click on the circle on the right here, and that will highlight it and automatically put that input on the node. Very handy, because otherwise you'd have to be right-clicking and going to add inputs, and there's a whole bunch of different ones and different menus. You never know what you're looking for. So just control clicking and adding it in via the attributes menu is very, very handy. But anyway, we are going to be pretty much playing with the roughness here, and we don't need all this extra stuff for now. So I will delete almost everything. Let's get rid of the wall and the liquid and the skull and the fruit bowl and the statue and even the cloth. And we'll just leave the shiny sphere that I've got right here. Excellent. And that will get our new material applied, and we'll be able to just see the updates here. Right now, the focus is getting removed, so I'll delete that. And now this should be in focus. We've got roughness cranked all the way up to 100%. But now let's move into, and it's always a struggle to do this with one monitor while I'm recording. Let's open up the asset browser and go track down the imperfections. Closing up the material menu, I'll move into our textures, and inside of textures, under HDR, you'll see the imperfections. And here's a whole bunch of new imperfections ready for us to play around with. And I believe these are all also 4K. These are created by David Gruwier. I'll give a little credit there. So selecting all of these nice new imperfections, I could download them all, right click and say download selected. And I'll let all of those download so we don't have to wait. It's over a gig because there's so many of them. So let's just let that run for a second. Okay, all downloaded, and we can take a look. Let's crank these up and we can see a much better resolution. And scrolling through, we can take a look at all of these different ones, which is really great. I mean, you can't go wrong with a bunch of smudges. Let's drag deposits directly into our node editor, and you can see that that has now immediately appeared. We get a little preview image. It's a good idea in this type of circumstance to feed this through a ramp, so we have lots of control over exactly how it's going to show up. So I'll feed the output from this imperfection map into the alternative input, which will then get output into our roughness. And that should translate directly onto this, which will refresh as soon as it goes through the material. Let's take a look at these imperfections coming straight through, getting applied. Once again, we don't have to go stepping through every single part of the process here, but inside of the ramp, we could make any kind of modification we like as far as saying like black is going to be very shiny. So we could say, well, we want it to be pretty shiny overall. So we'll drop this to a darker gray. And now overall, it's going to be significantly more shiny, but especially as it resolves, you can see these little imperfections catching the highlights. So adding a little bit of imperfection to everything is always a good idea. And having a large collection, turn that off, a large collection of imperfection maps that could be combined and layered and remapped. There's fingerprints and scratches. This is just a good thing across the board to be applied to every material. So I love that we have easy access to those inside of the asset browser. Next up, what do we got? Well, moving on to some new stuff inside of Redshift. Now, this is going to include things that have come out over the last couple months between the release of S26 and now, as well as a couple of tiny things that are coming out with the current version because the release cycles between Cinema and Redshift are slightly different. But in any case, let's start out with the most exciting one, and that is stuff involving volumes and Redshift. And that is the addition of Blackbody temperature stuff inside of Redshift. And this is way cooler than I thought it would be. I haven't played too much with the volumes when it comes to any of the third-party renderers, just a little bit. As I'm sure a lot of people have done, I went over to Jenga FX and I downloaded one of their VDBs, one of their free ones from Embergen. And I took this very first one because it just has a bunch of fire, and that's what we want to be checking out, this aerial explosion. So it took a while to download, but let's load it in. If we want to import a volume or a VDB for Redshift, we can go to the volume dropdown, grab a Redshift volume, load in the VDB. So I'll go track that down. I've got it right here. I'll load in the very first frame, not copy it over, go to animation. I'll say it is a simple animation. Detect the frames to get all of them loaded in. And we can even say that there is a bit of a preview. I'll say points. We don't need too many. Let's jump that up to what, like 30. So we got a couple of points there, so we can see a little bit of what it's doing. Now we need to see that render. So I'm going to open up this window, create a new Redshift material volume material. All these are things that you might have done in the past. Apply it directly. Let's open up a Redshift render view. Here it is. And I've got Sphere here just so we can get some context of how the lighting is, and an HDR already loaded into the dome light. Now, we don't see anything right away. If we select the Redshift volume object, you're going to see information about what channels came through. So we've got density, flames, and temperature. Let's copy the word density, and inside the Redshift volume material, I'll select the main node here. And we have the scatter output. So if I paste in density, then now something sort of exists there. And inside of our Redshift render view, we can instantly see the smoke layer appear. And obviously, there's a lot of things you can do as far as colorizing this and tinting it. Let's not worry about that yet because we want to move down into the emission area. Under emission, we need to feed in one of the other channels. So we could feed in temperature or flames. Honestly, I don't even know what the right one is, but what looked great right out of the box was selecting the node under emission, dropping in flames. So there should be something illuminating, and there's a specific channel for that. And that is currently being colorized via this black to white tinting. But instead, we can say the emission mode is not based on the color ramp, but now there is a black body setting. So by selecting that, we can affect a temperature and kind of get more of a mathematical version of what the flames would look like. And right away, those are looking pretty cool. I think for this particular setup, it's a little bit bright. So I'm going to drop it down to around 2000. And immediately we can see really nice flames and the colors of the flames inside of that. Brighten that up to maybe 3000. Just playing around, tweaking. I don't know what the correct settings are here, but immediately that is looking really cool. We can jump to any frame, see the animation. So jump over here, let that refresh, and fireball moving forward. If we turn off our dome light, actually I think everything's going to be still illuminated a little bit, so it's a good idea to make a very dim light so it turns off all the lighting. So that should make it dark. And now any illumination we have is going to be from the fireball. We could make that super bright. I can set that back to, select that. Set that back to the default temperature of, I think, 6,500. You see it's super bright. It's creating illumination, getting just cool looking explosions right out of the box. So I think that this is something that people have been looking for in Redshift. And like I say, it's pretty cool. So yeah, love the look of that right away. So wanted to put that one out there first. A couple of other details I want to throw out there that I don't specifically have visuals for, but it's worth mentioning that the Redshift CPU version now has 100% feature parity with Redshift GPU. There's a couple of things that didn't quite work where they didn't get transferred over perfectly. So things like the round corners, shading, that's been moved over to the GPU. And I think there's a handful of other things. I'm not sure what was limited, but that should be completely synced up now. In addition, there is also that the AMD GPU Alpha that is public allows Redshift to render on Windows and AMD GPUs. This isn't something that I have any knowledge of, but I want to make sure that to the people who that means something to, that they would be able to go and utilize those capabilities. So that is some stuff inside of Redshift. Getting into the home stretch here, let's move into the new Curvature Field. I like this one. To see the curvature, I'll open up this file with the elephant from the asset browser. I use this all the time. Selecting the actual elephant. How are we going to see the curvature? Well, a good way of visualizing it is a vertex map. So right-clicking on it, I will say I want a other vertex map. Inside the vertex map, I will control it using fields. Delete the freeze. And how do we actually get the curvature? Well, we drag the model directly inside the field. Now, we've had this for a while. If I select the model, we can set the mode to points and surface and volume, but now there's a new curvature. Selecting curvature, it is now going to be looking at the curvature. We got a couple different curvature modes. We've got convex, and we can change the radius to increase that. Essentially, these are very open areas, things that curve outward. They're kind of open to the sky in a way. And then we've got the opposite, which is concave, and these are areas that are more like pits. They push inside the model. Light would be a little bit blocked away. Kind of think of, I usually think of this sort of like ambient occlusion in a way. Next up is direct. Honestly, I'm not sure what direct does. It just seems to be a very high contrast version of it. And then we've got both, which will combine the convex and the concave at the same time. So beginning with concave, let's do something maybe a little bit silly. Now we've had curvature in Redshift for a while, but if you're using standard or physical, or you need to do some sort of effect here, like let's say clone only onto areas of curvature, there was no way to do that. So now that opportunity has opened up. But let's do a kind of silly example here. I would like to deform this model. So I'll create a plane effector, drop it inside as a child, set the mode to point. It'll kind of explode. I'll rename it to point.deform, just so we know it's a deformer now. Under parameter, I don't want to push out on Y. Instead, we'll push out on Z, push it out 20. You see it inflates. We kind of got this cutesy elephant. But turning that off for a moment, let's add in the vertex map. But I'd like to blur it a little bit. How would we blur a vertex map? Well, we've been able to do this for a while. What I would like to do is make a copy of the tag. Selecting the duplicate, I want nothing inside of it. So this vertex tag is empty. What do we feed in? Well, the first vertex map. So I'll drag the original one in, and the mode is set to nearest point, but instead I'll say average point. And that's going to look at the average of the values that was coming into it, which means we get a nice blur. Changing this radius, we can take that original sharp curvature and get it even further and a nice smooth gradient. Important to note that this entire effect is dependent on having a decent subdivision count here. If we don't have enough polygons, then we can't change values very quickly. There'd be, just not much resolution to it. So having done that, inside of our deform, important thing to note, under the name, it's important to rename vertex maps. This first one is vertex map. So the second one should have a different name. A lot of things in Cinema reference the name of the tag. So you want to have different names and nothing will get mixed up then. So inside the plane deform, let's attempt to add in our field, but we're going to see a problem right away. If I drag the field inside, it's going to look good. It's like, okay, that worked. It did apply. But if I hit play, or if we even go forward a frame, you're going to see it's moving. Like everything's wiggling around. Why would there be wiggling happening? Well, we've got a feedback loop happening here. We've got a vertex map that's dependent on the shape of the model. And then we're saying, okay, dependent on the shape of the model, deform it. But that changed the shape of the model, which changes the vertex map, which changes the way it's getting deformed. So we get this feedback loop. No good. So in order to fix that, let's make a duplicate of the original model. The first one won't be deformed, and we can just visually hide it. That's just for reference now. We don't need these tags on the second model, the one we're actually seeing. So this plane deform will just view the vertex tag from the other model. And if we set that to index, then it's like, hey, the exact point number gets applied. Everything just filters through really cleanly. I don't want to blur too much on this one. And like I said, this is a silly example, so I won't blur too much. But something I wanted to point out is if we don't have the vertex map on there, the entire thing inflates. It's good. But I feel like if you have the vertex map on there, it's almost got this weird, like, cutesy vibe to it. If we inflate that a little bit more, these spaces, the spots that are getting deformed outward, I feel like, I don't know, it's got a little bit more cute proportions to it than if we didn't. And let's push it further and be weird with it. Going back to the original vertex map, let's take a look at that one. With the second vertex map, let's invert the result. So now you can see that all those corners are now dark. Back into the plane deform, we are now seeing that as the result. So hide the original. Let's view the actual one. And now we get this crazy inflation, which is kind of fun. But now if we start pulling that further in, I feel like we can get this really nice emaciated look on the elephant, which is, you know, it's kind of like poor elephant. But it's a lot better than if we just applied it uniformly. You see, if I turn that off, if I just turn it off, the entire thing explodes. But by applying it only in specific sections that essentially can handle it, we get a very different look to the model overall. So like I said, very silly example there. But let's move on to a slightly more practical one. Pull this in. So here's a model from the assets browser. It is the KB connector U. I've got a vertex map on there. Set the concave. Let's say both, so we get lots of detail. Shrink this down so it's not overwhelming the model. And let's get a little bit of contrast going in here. I can create a modifier layer and say I want a curve. This curve, it will look at the 0 to 100% values. And I can pull this in and you can see I can increase the contrast. So we go all the way from essentially 0% all the way to 100. If we were inclined, I can duplicate that tag again. Let's immediately rename it. In the second one, let's do a similar idea. I'll turn off the curve for now, delete the curvature coming in from the model, and drag the first one in. We are referencing the first one, but of course, now we can average it. By averaging it, let's start with small numbers. It's a relatively small model. I can increase that to get a little bit of a blur on there, get this nice fade out. The curve can turn back on again, so I can remap this. Maybe it stays low. There's a little bit fading up, and then we can brighten up the other side a little bit more. Maybe we want a little higher values around. And actually, I'll pull that in a decent amount. I want to see a pretty heavy contrast there. So yeah, full values come back in. So we have now visualized exactly where these weights will be. So to be a little more practical, let's apply this to a material. Creating a brand new Redshift material. Create Redshift Material Standard Material. Double clicking. So we've kind of got this basic plastic look right now. I'll make that a bright orange, because why not? Ooh, kind of a red orange. I like that. And we want to apply this vertex map somewhere. So we need to bring in a vertex map. So we can search for the word vertex. Immediately we see vertex attribute. That's what I want. Drag this over. This will reference the attribute name. Like I said, it doesn't link to a tag. It looks at a name. So we'll drag vertex map 2 in there. So that should be a black and white map now. In fact, why don't we even drag that to output the color directly to the surface and open up our Redshift render view. And we should probably apply the material so we can see it. And as soon as we do, we can see that the vertex map is coming through directly onto the model. So now that that's coming through, we can use this as a mask. So what do we actually want to control? Well, I'm thinking, why don't we bring in one of those lovely imperfection maps? Underneath texture, we've got the imperfections. Here they are. And I'd like to find something with some scratches, maybe. This one's looking okay for me. Actually, let's grab that one, a little more scratchy. So there are some scratches. Searching for the word layer, we can get our color layer, and we get a lot of nodes, a lot of inputs out of the gate on that one. But we can say that we have a base layer, which is a solid color, and a final output, which will be the scratch map. And this will be the mask on it. So it's going to appear in some places and not in others based on where the curvature is. So dragging that onto the surface, we can see it output directly here. Let's see what the end result ends up being there. Where did the scratches get applied? And you can see the scratches are on the outside, the areas that would be getting hit. Now, we can map this a little bit better if I set that mapping. Let's just generically do cubic. And do we need to tile it all? Yes, definitely. So let's make this a little bit smaller, say 20 by 20 by 20. I am making this up as I go. So we get some scratches on the edges there. Very nice. Now that is just straight up going to the output. But I could say that I want that to drive maybe the metalness. Now, when it comes to metalness, you typically want to have it be black and white. So let's search for a ramp. And that ramp will be fed this color. We'll be driving the alt input, output that to the final so we can actually see what it's doing. And I want to really increase the contrast here. So that should be hopefully showing, yeah, that's nice and bright. We can feed this into the metalness. So let's break that connection, drive the metalness with it, and output our final standard material. So now as that goes to render, whoops, accidentally broke the color connection, connect that through here to be the alt input. And now we can see that some areas are going to be metallic and other areas are not metallic. So we can't get this plastic everywhere, but the interior, these scratches become metallic. By feeding that same color layer out to another ramp, let's output that as the alt input. And we will be driving the color with it, but the color this time will be, let's go from, I did like that red. It's probably gonna be hard to find again. Very saturated, dark red. It's a little more teal now. And then we can go to some sort of medium gray for our scratches. And we'll see, okay, cool. Now we have kind of this pink plastic and we get these scratches on the corners, but the corners are being driven via our field. So let's close that down and make changes to this now via our object manager. So clicking back on the original model and actually just a vertex map, let's apply this a little bit differently. Let's say that this is supposed to have more scratches in more places, so I can brighten that up overall. And we should hopefully see in our render that more scratches have now appeared. So we can tweak it kind of in real time. In addition to that, we can modify this in other ways. So let's, again, take a look at it in the viewport and create a random field. So this random field will be set to multiply or possibly overlay. I'll say multiply for now. And let's grab a different noise type, something crazy like a Luca. And we can actually see the Luca like forcing certain areas to erase out and others to pop in. And that's going to add more randomness to where these scratches have been applied. We probably don't want to go overboard on that, so I'll pull back a little bit. We can even drop the scale a little bit. Actually, I kind of liked it a little bit stronger, but the scale can go down. Yeah, make that a little bit messier, so certain scratches will appear in certain places. That's all filtering through. Now, that's pretty fun. It's relatively straightforward. Just to use it as a mask to drive something in a material. It could be driving colors, or like I said, where the scratches are, imperfections or smudges, a lot of different things we could change with that. But here's where I think it gets pretty neat. We can make additional models and drive those as well. So watch how simple this is. I've got a Velociraptor hanging out here on top of our model. So that will activate, and I can zoom out. Actually, let's pause the renderer just so we can do this quicker. So we got this raptor. We want it to do a very, all but identical thing. So why don't we just copy these vertex maps onto the raptor, and we'll just say, okay, but in this case, instead of referencing the original model, I want it to reference the raptor. So now the raptor's curvature is being filtered through, and you can see nice curvature there. And then if we click on the second layer, we can make sure that that is importing the very first vertex map. And now that's filtering in, and we can, in this case, we're blurring it. So we could blur it more, or we could blur it less, but I'll leave that at the small number. And then it's still being multiplied by this random field, which we could say, you know what, on the raptor, I want it to be, oh, let's blur this a little bit more. Or do we want to not blur it at all? Okay, yeah, we're going to go easy on the blur when it comes to the raptor. In fact, this radius is probably a little large because he's more detailed. So I'll shrink that. Yeah, that's a little bit more detail there. And now a little bit of blur would probably look good. Yeah, there we go. So I could multiply that noise field if I wanted to, or I don't have to. Or we could say, hey, multiply it on there, but less. I am individually controlling the curvature on a per object basis. But remember how I was saying that the materials, this vertex map tag, this vertex attribute, is looking at the name of the vertex map. So what that means is if I apply this exact same material onto the raptor and we reactivate our render view, then the raptor is going to get the same material applied because it has the same named vertex map of vertex map 2. So automatically getting applied on top of the raptor. I think that opens up some pretty cool opportunities, and just the beginning as far as like special effects or the ability for us to be controlling how stiff cloth might be. A lot of cool opportunities by adding in this simple curvature. Okay, 2 more to go. This one will be very quick. We've got the node editor and a couple of changes that have been made there. Opening a new file and then opening the assets browser, I would like to search for the word graph. If you haven't played with the graph spline that I designed, this is automatically shipping with Cinema 4D, and it's a really cool capsule setup. It does some really advanced generation of data visualization. But in any case, I'm just using this as a way of showing off our ability to right-click on it and say, edit asset as group. And that's actually going to open up your node editor, and this is going to be crazy, but this is like all the crazy stuff that went into making that. So we're able to edit the asset, and the reason for doing that is you can save additional versions that way. Now, a couple of things to note right away, and this is, maybe this was a bad idea because this isn't supposed to be intimidating, but I wanted to show off a couple of different things, and this is a good setup to show it. Firstly, we've got this info area, and it's a lot larger, which makes it more readable. Before, it was cropping off info, and sometimes it's hard to read certain things. Another thing to notice is, unlike previous versions, all of the lines are perfectly straight, making these connections, which makes it more readable, and it makes everything calculate quicker. They also did a lot of work as far as making complex graphs be able to run faster in the viewport. Like, so many connections were being made that those could slow down. Another thing that has changed, if we select a group of nodes, well, first of all, you can see that the nodes are they're readable from further away, which is nice. We definitely needed that. And if we zoom up, I can hit the letter L, which we've been able to do, which will rearrange them in an organized way. But now there's a little animation to show you how they've moved, so things don't suddenly disappear and pop into a new spot. In addition to that, we've got something that I'm very excited for. This was a very specific request that I had. If we hold down Control as I click, actually, you'll see as I mouse over this, if I hold down Control, a dot appears. If I click on that, I'm able to drag this dot around and make additional connections. So that means that I could say, hey, if I mouse over that, I can make a new connection from that and continue from there. So holding down Control or Command, we can make these dots. It's called dot rerouting, and we're able to add additional outputs and reorganize things. And you'll see something like here where it can get messy, where like this line is traveling all the way over to that. But I could be like, you know what, that's getting in the way. I'll make a dot there. I'm really far away, but we can make a new dot and move that up and get that out of the way so it's not colliding with things. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for organization there. Something else is if I zoom in, we can right click on a node and say, select all connected nodes, which we had, but now we can select upstream nodes, which it means everything that's getting fed into it. And we can also right click and say, select downstream nodes. So let's deselect one and say select downstream nodes. Now everything to its right that's actively connected has been selected. So just some nice workflow things that will definitely help with continued asset creation inside of capsules, and hopefully helps make it one step closer to your average users being able to use nodes a little bit. Don't let a setup like this be intimidating. You do nice, straightforward things, as I've talked about in other videos, for making like geometry modifiers and things like that. Close that down. And let's end with a little bit more simulation stuff with the addition of field forces in the new simulation system. Now, if you are not familiar with field forces inside of Cinema 4D, you should really take the time to learn it. It like adds so much power on top of the simulation systems and the MoGraph stuff and any particle stuff you do inside of Cinema via a system that can get complex, but the basics of it are not very complicated. And if you want an example of that, in my live streams that I do every Wednesday, I am constantly using field forces to solve problems. Whenever something comes up from a different piece of software, it's like, here's this super crazy rig. The answer is almost always, oh, let's use field forces. If you are not familiar with my live streams, head on over to YouTube/Rocket Lasso. And when I go live, this will pop open. I think it gives you a notification if you are subscribed to the main channel. And if you're not subscribed to the Rocket Lasso live channel, that's where I post the replays of any of those live streams, because I don't want to spam the main channel. So make sure to subscribe to that one, or go and check out any of the previous videos. I have guests on there. Rick Barrett from Maxon will join me often, and we'll talk about the new features that came out in the version. It's just really fun. Make sure to follow that, and it's a nice way of supporting me. But let's start talking about some of the cool things that we can do with field forces now that is integrated into cloth and rope simulation. Let's open up the scene file. Hitting NB, you can see I've got this spline being swept. It's got a decent number of subdivisions. I made this really simply by making a platonic shape, making it editable. If you go to edge mode, you can select that. And now you can right click and say edged spline and convert that to a spline. And then I subdivided that spline a couple of times, and that's how we end up with this. So we need to see some simulation. So right clicking on the spline, I will say simulation rope. Not changing anything else, everything at default, hit play, and you'll see everything will fall away out of the scene. Okay, cool. Let's turn off gravity. Control or Command D, go to your simulation and say gravity 0. With gravity at 0, I can hit play, and now you can see that they're not falling away, but they were kind of intersecting each other, so they all pushed away just a little bit. So the first change inside of the rope simulation is if I right click and say simulation connector, I want to connect these. So we've had this before from 26. I can say don't connect with other objects, connect with the same object. Hit create, and now everywhere that these are touching each other, it's going to make a connection. So now if I hit play, you'll see that they didn't explode apart. In 26, they would have still pushed away from each other, because even right here where maybe there's 5 different points intersecting, there would be 5 points fighting each other to push away. But now that they're connected, it's saying like, oh, okay, I'm connected to this other point. Ignore that one, which is good. That means this is now clean and stable. So having done that, let's create a field force. So saying, for that, I'll go to simulate forces, field force. Now, field forces are you can use them in a nice straightforward way. In this case, why don't we say add an old school or random field to it? And that's going to give a random direction everywhere. Give it a little more power. Let's say this goes all the way up to 55. And if I play, then we're going to see our lines start drifting around in this cloud of noise. So, that's cool, straightforward. Going under display, I'll say, hey, don't display the box. I don't need to get that feedback. And let's not use a random field. So that will kind of return back to its original shape because it doesn't have too much bendiness. Under the Object tab, instead of feeding something like random, why don't we feed the spline itself? So the thing that's going to be controlled is the same thing in the field force. Selecting that spline, we can see its settings. And we don't have to worry too much about this, but currently the spline shape is set to curve and along. What does that mean? Well, it means the forces that this is going to generate are oriented along the spline in the direction of the spline. I put this gradient on here. You can see that this is going from like start point to this end point. So where the blue is where the force is going to be most powerful, and it's pushing along that spline from white to blue. So not changing anything else. If I hit play, just having dragged that in, leaving it default, you see the entire thing is starting to twist around and get a little bit tangled. Now it's not very bendy, but it's still able to twist and move around just by feeding itself. And I think that's pretty neat right away. But this is using the velocity type of add to velocity. It's kind of like there's a wind blowing in a direction, but there's a different type that makes this look really cool. And that's changing this to set absolute velocity. That's saying like, hey, you have to move at this speed. So changing nothing else, just hitting play, immediately you can see all these different splines are forced to travel in a direction, and immediately they start getting tangled up with each other. Let's increase that radius just a little bit to 1 so that these are not, maybe even 2. They're not intersecting each other. And now you can see we get this mass of wires all tangled up with each other, but constantly traveling. So I just love the way that this thing is wrapping up. You can imagine baking the simulation and running it in reverse so you could form the shape. I'm not sure. Let's turn off the field force. I just want to see what happens. It's going to start kind of untangling itself. And let's see. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of motion still going on, so it's not going to calm down too much. So I would bake it and rewind it. But I love the way that these travel and start wrapping and tangling. Like there's no way that we could have done this before. I just love the way that looks. Now you can reverse the direction in that field force. I could say actually direction inverse, but I don't think in this case it looks terribly different. You see that they'll flow in a different way, but they'll still get tangled because they're all still connected. Having said that, what if they weren't connected? Let's delete that connection and then hit play. And now we'll see all those individual segments just traveling off by themselves. Now we'll see this in a little bit better form in a different file. In this one, pretty straightforward. Actually, let me even simplify this a bit. So I've just got a spline and I'm sweeping it exact same setup and I fed it back through the exact same way. Let's see if I made a change. Yeah, the only change I made is I said offset went from 0, which means there's a lot of power where it's blue and it fades off slowly. And I said, no, 100% power. So essentially it's going full power all the way along the entire spline. So not changing anything else. If I hit play, we've now got the spline that is traveling along its own path. There's no gravity. There's nothing telling it to stay in this shape. It's just being forced to move along in this particular orientation. Now that doesn't do too much right there by itself, but something I thought was neat is if we duplicate that spline, there are now 2 splines exactly on top of each other, but they can't stay that way. So when I hit play, they'll suddenly push out. They're kind of tangled up with each other and they're both still traveling and wrapping around each other. Let's do that again. I'll grab both and duplicate again. And this time I'll say, hey, splines, you are in a reverse direction. So 2 are going forward, 2 are going backward. Changing nothing else, hitting play, we've now got a more tangled up spline, and they're each passing by each other in 2 different directions. I did set these, I think, to a very low friction. Yeah, there's no friction here, so you can see they kind of smoothly pass by each other. But if I set the friction up to 1, they're going to start kind of grabbing at each other a little bit. And by adding in a bunch of friction, then maybe they will kind of cling to each other a little bit more. And you can see how they're starting to get tangled and they're pulling in a little bit more because you can't move past each other in a very smooth way. So yeah, that one's kind of fun. And then another one, if I open this up, you'll see I've converted just this text into a spline by, edge to spline again. Again, just sweeping it, feeding it back inside. Didn't even do the offset this time. And there's no connection. So it's kind of funny if you hit play, you get this entire thing kind of snaking away from itself. And you see almost like these little individual snakes flying away. It's still kind of forming that word. And you get very different properties depending on how bendy you tell it to be. If I say that this isn't very bendy, then it's kind of fighting itself. And all these shapes want to maintain their original shape a little bit more. And you can see it's a little bit more chaotic. And you see these pieces are trying to maintain their shape. Meanwhile, if I say they're very bendy and I hit play, we restart, you see how they stay a little bit more tangled and are traveling through and being a little bit more trapped. Now, eventually I wouldn't be surprised if one escapes, but because they're so bendy, you can see that this curve is constantly trying to, it's essentially almost creating a loop on itself. It's just spiraling around. So once again, just a cool visual with almost no effort. This is just the very beginning of scratching the surface of what we can do with field forces. I haven't even really played around with what we could do with adding this to cloth. This was also combined with the curvature. So we're pretty much at the end. Just for fun, I'm going to, again, show how some of our spline plugins work really well with this rope stuff. It's super crazy. Here's the duck model that I made, and I can feed that duck instead of converting to an edge. I can say, hey, be fed into a mesh to spline. So that's actually parametrically converting any model into a spline. So in this case, I can add the simulation rope tag, changing nothing else. And let's, how do I want to do this? Why don't we make another field force, do a very similar setup, forces. Field force, and let's set that to an absolute velocity of 55. Looking at this parametric spline, yes, as a spline object, it's going to force it forward. I don't want to display these tick marks for the vectors. So doing nothing else, hitting play, we see that all these individual lines are just taking their own direction and being forced forward and drifting and twisting and just traveling through the air. Stylistically, again, if we have it be not bendy or be very bendy, we're going to get different looks where these are very curvy now. They'll probably stay a little bit more in this localized area. And then we can connect all those together, right-clicking and saying simulation connector. Yes, the same object, not other objects, create those connections. Hitting play. Those are all now welded together, but still this force is forcing it to move around. And this could be anything that we feed in, like text or any model that you have. And then another fun thing would be instead of mesh to spline, we've got our other plugin called Ricochet. So if you click on Ricochet, then with Ricochet, I will say link to an object, and that object will be the duck. And if you're not familiar with Ricochet, I'll hide the duck. What's happening now is we've got this laser that's bouncing around inside of it. So let's make that, let's say 10 times as many bounces, and you see it fills up. And let's make that 10 times as many bounces again. And now there's so many splines running through this thing. Now, it would be a bad idea to run a simulation on that, like way too many. But we could probably do a reasonable amount. Let's do 5 times this amount. It'll fill it up pretty well. I would like to subdivide it because right now, there's not very many points making it up, and the simulation needs points to work from. So under spline, I'll say enable our spline types, and I'll subdivide that down to 5. And now let's make this a simulation. Right-clicking, simulation rope. And I'm going to say that it's able to be very bendy. And there might be some splines intersecting each other. So something I like doing is setting the radius as small as it can go, which is 0.0001. And keyframing that. And then just a few frames later, setting it up to whatever I want. So in this case, let's say 2. So it can slowly fill up the space. So having done that, making no other changes in this field force, doing nothing. Let's hit play and watch as the simulation, these slowly grow and they push each other out of the way. We can probably push that further now that I look at it. Let's say that this should fill up the space a lot more. So let's have this point, if I can perfectly select it. Let's say that will go all the way up to, I don't know, 5. So let's run that again. Slowly they'll go up to 5. And let's see if the splines, yep, you can see that they're fighting to fill up. Oh, and then they started escaping the model because I probably pushed that too far. Let's say 3. So let's see, let's let that fill up the space a little bit. And yeah, you just see how we get this nice curvy line traveling around, filling everything up a lot better. But having done that, we can turn that field force back on again, go into object, and you can see this one's broken because that was the mesh to spline that we deleted. But let's just replace it with this ricochet. And now that's going to be trying to travel around. So one giant line, it's going to push apart from each other and push forward. You see how this line is starting to travel. You see the tail right there getting pulled inside and traveling. If we were so inclined, we've also got this duck model. So we could say, hey, that is a simulation collider. And right now it's going to be only able to go on the front side. So let's say it can only collide with the back side of the polygons. So all those hopefully will be trapped on the inside of that, and they can't escape, perfectly filling up this shape and traveling around. We can set that to, whatever speed we want. Let's push that like way further, like 10 times the amount. And you see these lines are going super crazy trying to travel, and they're still trapped within the shape of the duck. So much fun to be had with simulations. As I do live streams and more tutorials, you'll be definitely seeing more of this. It's very, very powerful, so very fun to show off. And that's why I started and ended with simulations. So that is going to wrap up this video. This has been S26.1. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're watching this on the day the video came out, I will be live streaming today, and we'll probably be talking a bunch about these new features. And once again, make sure you head on over to YouTube/Rocket Lasso and subscribe to both the main channel and the archive channel. So until next time.